Good afternoon and welcome to Optimum Live, everybody. My name is Martin Crowson. Today we have a very special guest with us, and it'll be much better for Optimum MD Tom Heeley to introduce today's guest, Charlotte, who we're delighted to have with us today. So over to you, Tom.
Yeah, welcome, Charlotte. Charlotte and I went to uni together, Masters 2019, somewhere there.
18,
yeah, 18, 19. So I did the long version, so I did it part-time over 3 years. Charlotte did it 1 year full-time. And then you went on to work in football. You want to tell us a little bit about sort of your background in football, Charlotte, and where you went after sort of your Masters?
Yeah, so I finished my full-time Masters in Sport and Exercise Medicine at Nottingham, and made the decision to move into football. Wasn't really sure if it was going to be football or another sport, but that's where the opportunities came. And it was at Swindon Town with their boys academy, which was a Category 3 or is a Category 3 academy.
Yep.
I was there for a season. It was an eye-opening experience to work with under 18 boys, having, never really worked with that age group. But great fun and really enjoyed it. Had some first team exposure as well, so saw the other side of a League 2 professional setup. At that point I decided to make the move into kind of women's football and moved into Everton Women, which is a WSL team, where I was for 2 seasons during COVID as well, and then I'm currently at the Football Association, where I've been for the last 2.5 years.
Nice. Wonderful. And what's your title there, Charlotte?
So my title at the FA is Pathway Lead Physiotherapist for England Women's. So I oversee all the pathway teams from a medical and physio provision. So the staff that we have working on there, the support that we're providing to the players on and off camp, as well as ensuring, that medical governance and legislation, etc., is all being maintained by our staff.
Sure. Charlotte's very kindly agreed to join us today, whether you're watching us today on YouTube or LinkedIn, to explain not only her role, but some of the challenges maybe faced by women in sports these days. So thanks a lot for popping in, Charlotte, today. We have got a host of other information on the Optimum Derby YouTube channel if you'd like to find out some more information about various injuries. But for the time being, let's focus on Charlotte's visit today and crack on. How busy is your role, Charlotte, and where does it take you?
The role is incredibly busy. It's very varied. Like many things in sport, no day is the same. I think working in an international setup with a national team is a very different environment to your club environment, where every day can be different, but you've also got the balance of an on-camp and off-camp. So my role is kind of split into 2. I go on-camp, where we have the players for about 10 days at a time. I predominantly work with the women's under-19s. Okay. So for those 10 days, those players are ours, and we take them to tournaments or play against other national age groups of international teams. That's great. Hard work. You are traveling to wherever that tournament is. You know a little bit about the facilities with the recce's that are done, but you probably don't know the full amount. And you're working kind of off what you've got there and what you provided to make the best high performance environment possible. From an on-camp, off-camp perspective, I work with the players as a kind of touch points to clubs to see how they're getting on. I do a lot of project work, so developing, our understanding of where our players are at. How can we maximize their involvement and their availability when they're with us? And also leading other project works where we're looking into those insights to better understand, what gets us to win a major tournament as an England women's setup through the pathway and into seniors.
Interesting. You touched on those players at yours then for that time, those 10 days. How big is your link with the clubs, and how closely do you stay on top of their progress when they go back away from your control, as it were?
Huge. The clubs, as I say, they're ours. They're never really ours. We loan them from the clubs during that period. So obviously we're responsible for their care during that time. But if anything happens to the players, if we're unsure about anything, we're always contacting the clubs to speak to them, because their practitioners are the ones that probably know them best. They see them day in and day out. I guess the caveat to that is we're the experts in a tournament field, where players are coming to play 3 games across 7 days. We understand that response to recovery slightly differently to maybe a club or domestic team. But that conversation piece is huge. And I think it's one that requires a lot of work to ensure that you are seeing things the same as practitioners, one not being there from the club side to what we're seeing, but to have that open and honest conversation. Away from that, again, we're regularly, speaking to clubs and finding out how players are getting on, whether that's returning from injury in preparation for selection to England camp, whether that's players, we're unsure about how they're performing and we could really be pushing that performance to get them ready for tournaments that we have coming up, or, our big tournaments in the summer. We're working ridiculously hard to keep that communication there. I think also as well, the difference between the domestic game and the international game, there's so much education and learning that's happening to keep pushing those boundaries and getting players prepared to perform not only just for their clubs, but for England when they're with us.
Is that pressure on you to make sure those players are fitter for longer increased over the last 18 months to 2 years as the public, more women's sport is seen on a national TV scale? Does that pressure increase as a result?
It's definitely increased. I mean, the women's game is boomed, not only in public opinion and view, but also in what the players are outputting during games and when they're playing both domestically and internationally. So it's definitely increasing. As you see, there's always reports in the media around the number of injuries sustained within women's games, the number of ACLs.
Yeah.
And the caveat to that is we have increased the amount that players are playing and the exposure that they're undergoing on a season to season basis. It's exciting. It's amazing to see that people are so engaged and willing to, watch women's football regularly and, have that buy-in. But it comes with the consequence of we need to keep our players fit so that they can perform. And, especially our pathway players, because their goal is to be a senior lioness.
Yeah.
They want to be in an England shirt for their whole career and they want to become a senior lioness. So that pressure is there to give them that opportunity to be available and perform at their best, both for their club and for England.
Sure. We'll go back a little bit. I think it was 2019 that you made the move into women's sport from men's sport. Is that correct? At Everton?
Yeah, that's correct.
You've been in the women's game now for getting on for 4 or 5 years. So what differences, I know we can only sort of touch the surface today, but what differences were there when you first moved into women's sport, having been in men's sport for a while? And what did you notice? And did you have any challenges? And what were they like to overcome?
It's a great question. I think the challenges were, one, women's sport at that time was still going through its infancy. When I joined Everton, they'd been professional 2 seasons at that point. So players understanding those professional demands and the standards required to be a full-time professional athlete was still very much being learnt. We were bringing in more international players at that time, so understanding where they were coming from as within their development and integrating them into a team. We had a lot of, with a new head coach that had been there a bit before me, a lot of team change during that time as well. So preparing those players to undertake the domestic demands at that point that had changed significantly was a big task. Within that as well, we were based at a training ground where you had 4 professional teams between Everton men's first team, 23s, 18s, and then us.
Right.
And so the expansion of that and the limited space created a lot of difficulties and challenges. Everybody wants their players to have optimum opportunity to access the gym or to recover well or whatever they need. But at the same time, there's only one pool, there's only one gym, there's only one indoor for that snowy day that, you can't go outside. So that created a lot of, barriers that took time to unpick. And I think when I left Everton, there was a lot of work that was done and I felt I left it in a really great place. And I think the club has continued to progress in that direction. But with the boom and the recognition, that's really helped women's sport and women's football particularly to, you know, have its say and have its opinion and have its need for access to facilities. It's by no means the best, but there's been improvements, which is fantastic to see.
Okay, Tom, do you agree? You work with, you know, both males and females. Do you agree with Charlotte that things are going in the right way, the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, Charlotte's got way more experience in this sort of area than I have from a working just directly in a women's sport, and especially football. I've predominantly, most of my experience has been sort of across sort of GB settings where it's a slightly different setup from a training point of view and facilities and opportunities. It's pretty much the same, you know. There's no sort of priority in terms of who's got what. It's I know 5-10 athletes all have access to the same facility, whether you're male or female, doesn't really matter. So I can only imagine sort of working in that Everton setting that there's probably a bit of a hierarchy into who gets what at that time, and that's probably changed over the last 4 or 5 years as things have progressed. But it's interesting to sort of hear sort of, I suppose, about like the transition from the club to the international setting. Charlotte, do you do anything, I suppose, when the girls sort of arrive with you on camp, do you do any sort of testing with them, sort of like, or I guess, do you leave that with the club, or how does that sort of transition over from club to sort of international setting camp wise?
Yeah, it's always a challenging area because we want to get as much information about our players coming in, but every kind of club setting and profiling that's done at club is very different, club to club. So that transference of data and information into, I guess, what we would use internationally in our world can vary. Quite often our testing runs as more of a physical profiling testing. So it's run by our physical performance coaches, which is in support of understanding, you know, what is our players' readiness to perform in tournaments or over a 3-game or a 2-game congestion period. From a medical side, it's areas that we're investigating and looking at, but our time with the players is so minimal that, you know, we have to choose the tests that are going to give us the best information that has the best impact on are they going to be available and then can they perform, rather probably than the club's viewpoint of what is their baseline, what do we track on a seasonal basis to see where they're at, and what are we looking for more of a long-term perspective of a development across a season, a couple of seasons. We link in a lot around injuries, you know, so there will be those players that come in who have specific injuries that will put in more specific testing measure, whether that's handheld dynamometer testing or, you know, some other medical objectives to look at to kind of support our day-to-day monitoring of that player. When the player is with us, though, we do daily wellness, very similar to in clubs. And I guess our objective marker on that is a groin squeeze, which we do from a fatigue monitoring. So it does vary massively to club and the information that gets brought in.
I guess the data is always different as well, individual to individual. Kind of, you might be looking for different things across different players, across different positions, and even in the same position, measuring different things for different players, depending on what style of play you want to achieve or what performance outcomes you want from the next 3 games in the next 10 days. Like, you'll be picking different markers out and therefore selecting different players based on performance markers and things, obviously, as well as the technical side of things, but more from a medical, physical side of things. Yeah. And Charlotte, just talking about sort of age group sort of football versus sort of senior football, do you find I guess you've got quite an age range of athletes to support, almost sort of from 15 up to sort of young, well, women really. So I suppose young adults through to women. Do you find there's a difference in sort of those age groups and that range from 15, 16 up to sort of 21, 22, 23?
There is a massive difference. I think to really understand that is to understand what the women's domestic game is like, from not only a professional side, but right down to our kind of academy grassroots levels. And we have, within our kind of under 15s, under 16 talent pathway, we have players who come from, the likes of your WSL clubs. So they'll have their, under 16 teams at a Chelsea or an Arsenal. They could be coming from a grassroots setup. So their exposure to football domestically is so different. And not only just the football on pitch side of things, but the support and what they're getting off pitch. So their exposure to gym and S&C. So to bring those players together and at that young age group and understand where they're coming from, and then how we get them all to play together and perform together as a team within an England environment is a work of art in some frame.
Yeah.
But that's where understanding what the player is coming in with and who they are as an individual really helps us to then facilitate that support around them. A lot of our job medically at that kind of younger age group is predominantly around education and exposure. So what education can we give them that they can take away and use in their football career and make, the best of the resources around them and the support. But on the flip side of that, what exposure and how can we make them available as possible, that they have this opportunity to understand what it is to be an England player, and the needs and the demands that will increase as they go through. Obviously, as you progress up through that, you kind of become more into the PGAs or players who are on loan at first team environments, whether that's Championship, WSL, Tier 3, into those players that are getting professional contracts at at 18. So they have that committed tie to a club where they're being seen regularly more full time. So that touch point with that medical staff, that performance staff is much better, and they have a better wraparound support.
Yeah, nice.
Let's rewind a bit, Charlotte. Let's go back to your teenage years. We know you've done a master's degree, but what were your thoughts as a 16, 17, 18-year-old? What were your hopes, and what made you go and do a degree? And what was your learning route through to where you are now?
So 16, 17-year-old me was probably not sure what they wanted to do fully. Absolutely, was fully involved in sport. My mum was a PE teacher. I played every sport under the sun. So I knew I wanted to be active, involved, and, wasn't sure if I wanted to go down the sport route at that point. But physio kind of came across. I remember I grew up in Hong Kong, and I go to the Hong Kong Sevens, and one of my favorite things was seeing the physios run onto the pitch and be really intrigued by what they were doing and what was happening. So now I get to do that on a very regular basis. Exciting. And have done it in some pretty cool places. But so that for me was my route in. So at 18, after my A levels, I went and did a good degree at University of Leicester, Coventry at the time, as a physiotherapy BSc, which opened my eyes. I think there was, again, a real challenge, and many physios probably feel this, is you get trained in neuro, respiratory, cardiology, MSK, and you touch on all these areas, and then you're just kind of pushed into this big wide world of physio, and where do you go? So at that point, I made the decision to go NHS and did band 5 and band 6 rotations, just trying to decide where I was. But kind of keeping a foot in the door of sport. So I worked with a local rugby team for a couple of years and kind of set up their physio provision that they had, as well as working with English Schools Football Association. So they are kind of players who are attached via or recommended via their school PE teachers that are selected to represent England, but not as an English Football Association representation. But we take them abroad. We took them to the sunny sides of Belfast one time, and then the even sunnier side of Spain. But that opened my eyes to international football as per se, and the demands of traveling with a team. And at which point, that was when I decided to go and do my master's full time and progress into full time sport. So it's probably been a different journey to some people who have gone straight into sport.
Yeah.
I see the perks of doing the NHS. I learned a lot. I developed skills that weren't just MSK based physio skills. But if I'd had the opportunity again, maybe I would have gone straight into football or straight into some form of sport and learned that way along. But I think that was the opportunity at the time. That was kind of what was recommended for me, and yeah, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, Charlotte, you've got the physio background, Tom's background more in sports therapy. So between you, how do you sum up the options available to somebody that maybe is just about to make those decisions that you just spoke about, Charlotte, and which is the best route to go down for me if I want to get into sport? Tom, start with you, maybe.
I think it's a good question. I think it's probably, don't take this the wrong way, I think it's probably easier for Charlotte. I think the CSP, sort of the physiotherapy route, opens probably more doors straight off the bat. I think if you were to look at any jobs advertised on UK Sport, they will all sort of say, what's the official words, like expected or needed requirements for the role are Chartered Society of Physiotherapy, and then it might say or physio or sports therapy, but predominantly it will say physio. So I think from that point of view, but like Charlotte said there's so much learning that's completely different to both degrees. Like you could ask me some respiratory questions and a stroke patient, for example, I wouldn't even know where to begin. But then I don't see those patients, so I don't see that sort of work. So it's completely different. I think that's why it's good to have a mixed team across sort of a different setting. So whether that's a football club or a rugby team or whatever it is, I think it's important to have a mixed bag of people in that medical department, because they've all got different skills from different areas. So, for example, if someone had something that I thought was a bit funny, I'd just pass them on to Charlotte and say, with your experience and your skills, you have a look at this and what do you think's going on? So I think it depends on what route you want to go down and sort of, yeah, it's a hard question to answer, I suppose.
Horses for courses then. So, and Charlotte, do you agree with what Tom said? And it basically sounds to me as a layman, like, make sure you do your research beforehand.
I think it probably is easier for physios. I think physio is a harder degree to get into from a A-level qualification compared to sports therapy or sports rehab. And I guess that then comes with the caveat that we are HCPC regulated, we are CSP members, which adds that extra kind of element. But, I know a lot of sports therapists. I've worked with different sports therapists who are excellent clinicians and, have probably greater knowledge than I do at times, because they've had that kind of more sports specific training for 3 years in that MSK side. That's then allowed them to transition into that environment more smoothly. I think going back and doing my sport and exercise medicine course made me realize that there was areas within that MSK knowledge I was, knew but didn't know to the same detail as other people that were on our masters at the same time, who had done other degrees. Obviously we had a bit more knowledge than certain, I'd been clinical for a while, so I was probably in a better place than some people. But I think it's where you're at from an educational perspective. I don't think it's a no. I guess the challenge that comes with it is where you want to go in your career as well. And unfortunately with us within the FA, we have a physio as an only within our national teams. That's, you have to have a physiotherapy degree. And I guess that prevents that progression if you did want to go into a higher level football environment that required that. But there are opportunities out there, and there is opportunities to really do sports therapy and then change at a later date. I don't think that should stop somebody to be going to do sports therapy as BSc, because you can retrain, you can go and do top up courses or masters in physiotherapy or whatever those additional courses are, and you're probably going to go in a better position because you'll have had that base knowledge from your BSc, some really good clinical background work, I'm sure, to then take that forward and be successful in whatever higher education you would decide to take on.
Okay. And for somebody starting their education journey soon, in 3 or 4 years' time, they're going to be finished and going out into the big wide world. are barriers being broken down for women to come through that pathway and to land top jobs in the sport now, in a sport tradition, especially like football, traditionally dominated by men across the board?
I hope so. As my answer, I definitely think when you look across the board, there seems to be more women in sport. You know, not just as players and athletes, but when you look across that backroom staff and within broadcasting, etc. There's so many more women present, which is really exciting. I think, you know, sport is a demanding environment, and to work within sport and within football, within whatever, you have to be prepared, and you have to understand that there are going to be sacrifices. It isn't, you know, your NHS 8 till 4 job where you have the odd on call and the odd weekend. You know, you're probably away every weekend, or you're committed every weekend, and you get a short break in the summer and maybe a little bit of time at Christmas if you're within the women's game like I am. But it is full on for that period of time. But it's incredibly rewarding. There are challenges, you know, there, as we've seen media articles that have come out that, you know, talk about women in sport, not just as players, but backroom staff. We have to overcome that. And what we can do is be really skilled and great practitioners who work hard to the same level as our male counterparts, and be just as dedicated, just as knowledgeable. So I think there's definitely a place for women in football and sport. It's improving, it's growing, the game's growing. So there's no reason why, you know, you shouldn't look at it and say, yeah, I want to go and do that, and I want to be, you know, at the top of whatever Premier League team you want to be. Like, nothing is not achievable.
Okay. You both, let's look at wrapping things up. You both work with professional sportsmen and women. Just tell us just how rewarding that process is. You just very briefly touched on it there, Charlotte, but you start us off, Tom. You work with professionals. What's it like? Do you sometimes pinch yourself thinking, I've not made it, but got to where I wanted to be?
Yeah, in a way. Yeah, in a funny way. Yeah, really lucky. Yeah, really lucky. I something popped up the other day. I think it was on Instagram. There was it was Jenny Jones 10 years ago to this day. She won gold for GB at the Olympics, and I remember being part of that team prior to that, although not being for very long, maybe 9-12 months, but being part of that team and getting a message off a couple of people who were within that team, just saying like, thumbs up, well done to everybody, you know, whoever that was, being big or small. And that was a bit of a pinch myself moment 10 years ago, and it still is now, to think that's flown by, really. So that's a bit scary, but yeah, but that's still rewarding now. Even 10 years ago, you kind of look back and think, wow, that's bonkers. Yeah, it's brilliant to be a part of something that's a Olympic medal winning individual sport. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, Charlotte.
It's incredibly rewarding. I think when you see, you know, not only individual players who succeed, especially if they've gone through challenging times with injuries that you've supported with, but the team success. Like, I was at Wembley the day that we won the Euros, and, you know, that's you know, not being directly involved with the team, but knowing and working with a couple of the players that played within the team, to see them succeed and achieve something as a team status and an individual status was, you know, incredible, and something I'll never forget. And the benefits and the downfall or the outfall of that since has been amazing. And I think, you know, the work I get to do now, I'm so excited about seeing some of those players that I've worked with over the last few years put on that senior lionesses shirt and hopefully do another Chloe Kelly of scoring the winning Euros goal for us to secure the win.
Fantastic. Sounds great. Just before we do call it a day today, this popped up on one of my timelines today. Charlotte's won an award, so now you're live. You have to talk about it, Charlotte. What's this?
So myself and Harriet, my pathway lead doctor colleague, we were nominated for an FA People Collaboration Award, which we won a couple of weeks ago, which is staff, you know, our colleagues nominated us for it and wrote a recommendation that we should be award winners. And it was for some recruitment work that we've done within our talent pathway, where we, you know, are seeing and looking at over kind of 2,000 players or getting referrals for 2,000 players a season. And we're looking at those players to see if they can move into our pathway. So we provide medical support for those events, and having the recruitment that went through that and being recognised for what is now a successful talent pathway set up medically was great.
Great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Charlotte. It's been great to hear you talk about not only your job, but the pathway to getting there. I'm sure there'll be many people watching this find that really useful for their own hopes and ambitions in the future. So thank you very much from both of us for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me.
Tom, thanks for joining us as ever. We'll catch up with you again soon, probably next week.
Perfect.
Folks, thank you very much for joining us today as well, whether you've been watching us on YouTube or LinkedIn today. As I said earlier, please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're watching us there to find out when we're back on and what sort of topics we're going to be covering in the future. Please check out the topics and videos we've already got on that YouTube channel, so you can find out a little bit more about common injuries that affect all of us. And please catch up with us again next week when we're back here on Optimum Derby Live. Thanks for joining us. All the best. Bye-bye.